And now we have more evidence that Vladimir Putin of Russia is behind Donald Trump. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So we're well aware of the sanctions that the United States and our allies have been engaged in against Russia in protest for their invasion of Ukraine. Despite claims to the contrary, the sanctions actually appear to be biting pretty hard on the Russian economy and on Russia's ability to continue their war in the long run. In fact, in something of a surprise, where the Russians have been very careful to manage their message, Vladimir Putin also even admitted that the sanctions were hurting the Russian economy. And despite claims to the contrary, it appears that the sanctions we've imposed on the Russians really are taking a bite in their finances. Proof of it is that where Russia once was able to essentially finance its war by selling oil on the global market, these sanctions have hurt them so much that now they're basically one budget deficit after another, reducing their ability to finance this war in the long run. After all, because of the fact that Russia at this point does not have the ability to borrow money in international markets, and we've frozen basically all of their assets overseas, at this point, they're relying upon funds that they have within Russian borders, mostly in terms of gold. So each time there's a budget deficit, Russia has to sell some of its holdings of gold. Well, those gold holdings are not going to last forever. And there's a sense that within the next year or so, Russia's going to be starting to face some severe financial hardships. So in response to this, the Russians, of course, have tried to fight back economically on their own. At first, they thought that stopping natural gas from going to Europe would basically freeze residents of the Western allies there and make it so that they would back down on their support for Ukraine. Well, as it turns out, we had Mother Nature do us a favor. Maybe God is on the side of the Ukrainians. And we had a very mild winter in Europe. That, combined with the fact that the Europeans aggressively worked to reduce energy consumption and to look for alternate sources of natural gas, meant that the Russian effort to freeze Europe basically fell flat. Well, now the Russians are basically banning the export of a whole host of products to the West. But frankly, their leverage is pretty limited given the fact that the world doesn't buy much from Russia. I mean, Russia, to give you just an idea of their influence globally, has an economy smaller than the size of that of Texas. So as an economic power, they aren't even in the same ballpark as the United States, China, and our Western allies. So in the latest tit for tat, Vladimir Putin announced a list of 500 Americans who are going to be facing sanctions from the Russians. Now again, unless you specifically have business in Russia, which most Americans do not at this point, these sanctions really can't do a whole hell of a lot to you. So you would think that this story about sanctions would be kind of a who cares story. But there is one interesting thing that came from this story, and it is just who did the Russians decide to sanction? I mean, it would make sense for them to be sanctioning people like Joe Biden or Anthony Blinken or American business people who have major business interests across the globe and who might have withdrawn their investments from Russia. Or for that matter, other global policymakers would make sense. But here's an interesting one, Brad Raffensperger. You might remember him. He's the Secretary of State from Georgia who refused to find those 11,000 votes on that beautiful phone call by Donald Trump. Or how about Jack Smith? Yes, that Jack Smith, the special counsel who's investigating, you got it, Donald Trump. Or how about Letitia James, the Attorney General from New York, who is currently suing Donald Trump? I mean, the only way it could have been more obvious who the Russians are targeting with these sanctions is if they'd included Jean Carroll on the list. Yes, the point is, these are people who have nothing to do with Russia policy. Most of them probably have never set foot in Russia at all, and likely never will. But what they have in common is that they're Donald Trump's perceived enemies. Either a special counsel investigating him, an attorney general suing him, or a Secretary of State who refuses to find the votes to give him the election that he lost. So for all the bluster about how Donald Trump is not a tool of the Russians, This is the irrefutable evidence. And if you wonder why Donald Trump is saying that we need to back away from supporting the Ukrainians, and how he would negotiate a settlement between the Ukrainians and the Russians, well, I think it's pretty clear who's pulling his strings. Well, if you want to see another video where I talk about how a corrupt Russian oligarch has been linked to Donald Trump, check out this video over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.